If you happen to be a girl or a woman in the Philippines, chances are you've grown up with strict parents who have a set of beliefs about how you should behave, what you ought to do or not do, how you should dress up, and what you should be doing in your life in terms of education and career. Sure, some parents are stricter than others, and yes, it is entirely possible that you never had to grow up with strict mothers and fathers at all. But in strict households, the relationship between a daughter and her father is a particularly interesting dynamic in a Filipino context. Female friends of mine when we were younger appeared to have led this double life of being daddy's little princess, beholden to him and no other, and also wanting to break out so badly of this mold of being the perfect and obedient daughter. The amount of times I had to lie for my girlfriends or assist them in their efforts to sneak out and meet up with their boyfriends cannot be counted on two hands anymore. Most families grow out of this as their daughters grow older, but what happens when the family, specifically the father, continues to exert immense and oppressive control over his adult daughter to the point of being abusive? Well, it results in a case that is still being talked about 6 decades later. This is the case of the Cabading family murders. Mabuhay LagimFam, welcome to the season finale of season 3. Please make sure to stay until the very end of this episode for some minor announcements. Thank you so much to all of you for the support this season, and I hope you stay tuned for season 4. As always, some details in this episode may be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourselves whilst listening. Nonilo Quitangon felt uneasy, sitting in this lavish house where his brother Leonardo, fondly called Narding, and his sister-in-law Lydia used to live since their wedding up until a few days ago. He was still clutching the cup of coffee that he was handed by his brother's father-in-law. His brother had now disappeared upstairs to see his wife. More noise could be heard from upstairs, so Lydia's mom went upstairs, followed shortly by her father. It was looking like they were all going to have a family discussion. The atmosphere was tense. Narding and Lydia had just come back from Maragondon, Cavite, where they hid themselves for a short while from Lydia's father, Pablo Cabading. Ever since the couple wed back in September 1960, life had been difficult to navigate for the newlyweds, especially because they were essentially forced to live in the Cabading home on 1074 Zapote Street in Makati. By January 1961, no one could know that what started out as a promising and loving marriage would soon end in grief. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Cabadings were by all accounts self-made and successful. Patriarch Pablo Cabading was a Manila police detective described as a strapping Ilocano who very much looked like a police officer, full of brawn and guts and force. Mother Anunciacion Cabading was rather unremarkable and docile, seemingly only speaking when spoken to by her husband. Then there was Eduardo Cabading, the family's 8-year-old foster son, and Lydia, the couple's only biological child. Lydia was sweet, soft-spoken, with a mysterious air about her. When she was merely 23, she met 35-year-old Dr. Leonardo Quitangon, or Narding to family and friends. He worked for the University of Santo Tomas, where he taught medical classes, which was how he met Lydia. They instantly bonded because both of them were mild-mannered, people of few words, and also family-oriented. The late writer, historian, and journalist Nick Joaquin, who wrote the article The House on Zapote Street, remarked that although the new sweethearts dated steadily shortly after they first met, it was always noticeable how Lydia did not talk much about her family or her home life. She certainly gave the impression that her father, Pablo, was a strict parent who protected his only daughter like any good parent would do. The longer the couple were together, however, Narding noticed how Pablo Cabading seemed to go over and beyond normal parental duties, especially as his daughter was already 23 years old. He came off as overzealous and overbearing to the point that he insisted on driving his adult daughter to her classes and picking her up himself every day. Even for the Philippines in the 1960s, this was seen as a bit too much. Now, Lydia was in a medical internship when she first met Narding, and as that internship eventually concluded, she may have felt more confident in having her new boyfriend come around her house more frequently. After all, he was also there to help his girlfriend as she prepared for her board examinations. Naturally, there was a sense of trepidation from Narding, who knew how Pablo Cabading was. Surprisingly, though, the older Cabading seemed to approve of Narding, telling him that before him, none of Lydia's boyfriends ever lasted. He did not like them at all, and he scared them away purposefully. Pablo, however, told Narding that he was a good man and that he liked him. As time went on, Narding also got to know the two housemates who lived with the Cabadings. Normalinda Gapus was 15 and Corazon Versosa was only 12. The family also owned a big dog that would be chained near the front of the property during the day and left to roam freely at night. Now, after much hard work and preparation, it was time for Lydia to finally sit her board examinations, and when the time came, she passed them. The couple then thought that maybe after Lydia's big achievement, they could also take their relationship to the next level. Narding wished to marry Lydia, and although her answer was a no-brainer, he still needed to ask Pablo Cabading for his daughter's hand in marriage, and it was not going to be easy. Pablo put forward two conditions. Narding needed to firstly pay a dowry of 5,000 pesos. Secondly, the wedding needed to be a lavish one. Narding responded that whilst he could afford a lavish wedding, he was not too sure about the dowry. But there was no budging Pablo Cabading. He demanded a dowry. It took some time for Narding to get some money together, and after having put together 3,000 pesos, he approached Pablo again and asked him to reconsider the dowry amount. Pablo agreed, but only subject to a final condition. The couple must live with the Cabadings on Zapote Street. Pablo explained that he built the house for his daughter and that she should be living there. Narding felt like he had no other choice if he truly wanted to marry the love of his life. So he agreed to the final condition, not knowing what he just walked into. Nick Joaquin's article and several other articles with details about who Pablo Cabading really was when at home and in his comfort zone gave me the impression that in today's understanding of people, he could easily be diagnosed as having narcissistic personality disorder. A very simple definition of this disorder is given by the Mayo Clinic website, and it says the following, quote, "Narcissistic personality disorder is a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others." End of quote. And this somehow fit Pablo Cabading's behavior almost too perfectly. According to Nick Joaquin, Narding noticed how the family's life mainly revolved around Pablo. He was the star and the center of all their attention. Everybody's default disposition was to be and remain submissive to the patriarch. Everyone, and I mean everyone, supposedly trembled at Pablo's voice, even the big dog. Narding would remark to his family that during date nights with Lydia, when the couple would venture out to watch a movie, Pablo insisted on tagging along with them. In the car, he always sat in the front and would be enraged when he could not do so. Furthermore, whenever someone arrived at Zapote Street, especially if they are part of the family unit, Pablo did not like it when they did not proceed to the living room right away to talk to him. The conversation between whoever walked into the house and Pablo was not really much of a conversation as well. Pablo usually did most of the talking, but he needed an audience, and he needed to have the audience in his line of sight at all times. What Pablo hated the most was whenever Narding and Lydia would retire to their room at the end of an evening, just listening to the Cabading patriarch. Pablo would shout at his daughter, commanding her to sleep in her mother's bedroom for whatever reason he could come up with at that very moment. He did not seem to like the thought that his daughter was already a wife and may have wanted to be with her husband in the little time they actually get to spend together outside of their jobs and the required sitting time with Pablo in the living room. After a short while, Narding noticed that just like the other people in the Cabading home, he suddenly felt this sense of hopelessness or brokenness, as Nick Joaquin would describe it in his article. And this is the kind of effect that victims of narcissists feel amongst a lot of other things. Having to walk on eggshells because of the narcissist, or having to dedicate your whole being to centering the narcissist and all his needs instead of one's own well-being and autonomy, can genuinely tear down your resolve. Narding was growing more and more concerned that this arrangement at the Cabading home would simply not work long term. One rule that Narding had to learn the hard way one night was how Pablo insisted on locking the doors and gate to his home after a certain time, essentially imposing a curfew. If you could not make it on time and you knocked in order to be let in, know that your efforts would be futile. When something like this happened to Narding, forcing him to spend the night at his parents' home in Santa Mesa, Manila, he figured that he finally needed to talk to his wife about moving out. However, plans to even take Lydia out of the house just for a talk or a walk was met with hostility by Pablo, who, just to be clear, possessed at least one gun and gave the impression that he would not shy away from using it should his will not be followed at all times. Now, one of the last straws for Narding was when Lydia had to take her oath as a new physician. Pablo told Narding that since he did not contribute to the studies of his daughter financially, there was no reason for him to come along. Pablo wanted only himself and his wife to attend the oath-taking. This was heartbreaking for Narding, especially because he and Lydia grew and nurtured a huge part of their relationship when Narding was helping her study for the board examinations. But Narding, even as a husband, was powerless. It was this powerlessness that finally made him give up, at least temporarily. After spending 2 months on Zapote Street, Narding moved out. He wanted to take his wife with him, but he was standing against Pablo, Anunciacion, and essentially the whole house. So Lydia was left behind. From what Nick Joaquin wrote, it would seem that perhaps Narding had dropped by many times to catch a glimpse of his wife or a moment to talk to her after he moved out, but these moments were rare because she was always accompanied by either Pablo, the foster son, or her mother. One day, Narding heard that his wife managed to bag a position at a nearby hospital. So he felt then that he could potentially catch Lydia there and finally have a moment alone with her. It would seem that the one time Narding attempted to seek out his own wife at the hospital was also the time when Pablo came by to pick up his daughter. Lydia never went back to the hospital again after that day. It was a tough time for the young couple, but for Narding, it may have appeared even tougher because he did not know if he'd ever see his wife again, if he'd ever manage to finally encourage her to be brave and leave Zapote Street. But then something happened, or rather, Lydia revealed some good news. She was pregnant, and with this huge change in the couple's circumstances, Narding knew that he needed to work even harder to finally get Lydia to leave her father's place. Just before December 1960, Narding visited his wife on a day when he knew Pablo Cabading would be out. Even then, Lydia was too terrified to even receive some money that Narding had handed to her through the locked gate. That's how petrified Lydia was. Instead, she told him to mail her a check. And that was it. By December 1960, Narding attempted to deliver a Christmas gift to his wife, but he was left hanging for a very long time outside the Cabading home. He stood at the gate knocking for what seemed like an eternity, but no one from the Cabading home seemed to be willing to open the gate to him, at least not until much later. The gate and doors of the Cabading home were finally opened to Narding, and he was able to briefly talk to Lydia. She told him that her father was amenable to have a conversation with Narding's father, Eugenio, in order to discuss what to do with Narding and Lydia's situation. Narding left Zapote Street a bit more hopeful than he had felt in ages. When the patriarchs of the two families were finally due to meet, the Kitangons were left outside the gate, knocking and calling for attention for a few minutes. The Cabading house itself stood dark. It was not until a few more minutes later that one of the housemaids came out and informed the Kitangon party that actually Pablo Cabading was not in. This was a lie. Pablo was very much in the house, but apparently could not quite figure out yet what he wanted to say to the Kitangons, and so he left them hanging. On the 15th of January, Narding awoke to an early call from his wife. She'd had enough and asked him to pick her up as soon as possible. The couple agreed on a time and a place. Lydia agreed to meet her husband at a church where she would be escorted by her foster brother. Narding picked them both up and then dropped off Eduardo at Zapote Street. The couple then sped away, heading to Maragondon, Cavite, where Narding's family owned a property. On the way there, Narding informed his brothers about what just happened, and he also warned them that there was a distinct possibility that Pablo Cabading would be looking for his daughter at the Kitangon home in Santa Mesa. He also warned them that he could become violent. It was important for Narding that his parents be protected because who knew what Pablo Cabading was capable of? As it turned out, he was capable of a lot. The morning after Lydia's escape, Mr. and Mrs. Cabading stopped in front of the Kitangon house, having ridden in by taxi. Immediately, Pablo started screaming and demanding that the Kitangons produce his daughter ASAP. Nonilo, one of Narding's brothers, lied and told Pablo Cabading that they did not know where the couple went, but that they knew that Lydia was safe with her own husband. Pablo was not appeased by this. If anything, it seemed to have made him angrier. He ran to the taxi he and his wife rode in and grabbed a submachine gun, pointed it at another brother of Narding's named Jean. The two brothers tried to de-escalate the situation and asked the older Cabading if they could all just sit down and discuss this quietly and calmly. Pablo seemed to have thought for a moment about this. He lowered his gun and demanded that Lydia be returned to him by midnight, threatening the Kitangons' lives along the way. Things were obviously only temporarily de-escalated at this point, and the events that transpired from this point onwards show a man that used to be in full control of everything and everyone in his life, but not anymore. He was now someone who was finally losing grip on the most precious thing and person in his life, his daughter. I've had a few thoughts about why Pablo Cabading was intensely protective and possessive of Lydia, and how this could explain what he did next, or how this fit in our general understanding of Filipino family dynamics. I will share these thoughts much later in the episode. For now, let us go back to the evening of the 16th of January 1961. At around 8 o'clock in the evening on the 16th of January 1961, Jean Kitangon arrived in Maragondon, Cavite. Lydia and Narding were still on high alert, obviously, but he could see that the two were also feeling elated by the fact that they were away from Zapote Street. The three of them ate a late dinner, and Jean did not tell the couple right away what happened in Santa Mesa. When he finally told the couple, he could see the panic in them. Lydia was adamant that she did not want to go back to Zapote Street. Jean, probably just wanting to help the situation, told the couple that Pablo seemed to have calmed down and could be reasoned with. Lydia refused to believe him. After all, she knew her own father better than anybody in that room. Nick Joaquin wrote about this moment, quote, "And the brothers at last had glimpses of the girlhood she had been so reticent about. She told them of Cabading's baffling changes of temper, especially toward her, how smiles and fond words and caresses could abruptly turn into beatings when his mood darkened." End of quote. Up until this point, Nick Joaquin and the other people who wrote about this case did not really put much emphasis on abuse, let alone physical abuse, but with the mention of beatings, a lot of what happened after this night made so much more sense. Jean, taken aback by the revelation, or perhaps at this point confirmation, about who Pablo Cabading really was, said that he could not force either of the couple to go back to Zapote Street. The couple then said they'd talk it over. Jean said, okay, and a few minutes later, he found them praying together in a different room. Nick Joaquin's description of this scene, obviously taken from Jean's account of things, is particularly heartbreaking, in my opinion. Here are two people who genuinely loved each other, who were about to have a baby, but who also understood Filipino family dynamics in that they could just not run away like in the movies. They knew they were on stolen time, and sooner rather than later, they needed to confront all of the families. When the couple finished their prayer, they informed Jean that they would both go back and die together. This was a rather ominous thing to say. The couple probably had a sense of foreboding already, but somehow also could not just tear themselves away from their families, especially the Cabading family. I feel that years of abuse can do this to you. We all have heard stories about women who can never just leave relationships that are abusive, or women who did manage to leave, but then got roped in again by whatever charisma or force exuded by their abuser. Although I'm not saying that this is what happened to Narding and Lydia, there was something there that made them believe that it could either go very well or very wrong, but at least they would be together. I am sure, though, that on some level, as I already touched upon, they felt beholden to report back to their families because, as Filipinos in the 60s, of all times, one does not simply run away. Those who manage to do so risk losing their connections to their families or risk being branded as pilia or pilyo, meaning the naughty one, or being branded as the failure or black sheep of the family. Of course, this is a generalization, but anyone listening to this podcast right now has known someone or have heard about someone in the extended family or even the immediate family who ran away and had to bear all sorts of negative consequences for doing so. Narding and Lydia may have felt like they did not want to deal with those consequences if indeed, as Jean said, Pablo had already cooled down. So all three of them decided to rest for that night, knowing that it was too late to drive back to Manila already. This brings us then to the 17th of January. Jean, Narding, and Lydia were back in Manila but headed to the Kitangon home in Santa Mesa. They also decided to approach the police, but they were not much of a help. It was then decided that Narding's dad and his brothers, Jean and Nonilo, would head over to Zapote Street to talk to Pablo, in the hope to smooth things out at last. When they arrived there, Pablo Cabading seemed to have been in a good mood, even committing and saying that he was not planning on objecting any plans by Lydia to fully move out of the house on Zapote Street. The Kitangon men were elated when they heard this. They were so elated that they urged Pablo to tag along with them and talk to Narding and Lydia at the Santa Mesa home. So, all four men headed over to Santa Mesa. When they arrived there, Narding and Lydia probably felt a bit confused seeing Pablo Cabading there, but what followed was a seemingly calm and productive discussion with Pablo himself, who reiterated that he did not want to object to Lydia's plans to move out of Zapote Street anymore. This seemed to have lifted the dark cloud that hung over the two families for the last 24 hours or so. To celebrate the moment, Jean thought it would be a great idea to treat the Kitangon men plus Lydia and Pablo to a meal at Mac's Chicken. Pablo at some point insisted on paying, but Jean eventually paid for the meals. All seemed well. Lydia and Narding then made their way back to Santa Mesa with the Kitangons, whilst Pablo Cabading headed back to Zapote Street. For at least a few hours there, the young couple probably felt like this all might just work. Knowing what I know now about this case, it is likely that Pablo Cabading was slowly but surely spiraling after that little celebratory meal. It would not have been obvious to anyone, let alone Narding and Lydia. Perhaps Mrs. Cabading knew, but of course she'd never tell. But looking back, it is very likely that Pablo could just not truly give up the idea of holding back his daughter from ever moving out of his house. On the 18th of January 1961, Pablo Cabading called the Kitangons in Santa Mesa to ask Lydia to come down to Zapote. Her mother seemed to have fallen ill. Narding escorted his wife to Makati, but they both quickly realized that there was nothing wrong with Anunciacion Cabading. So they both left Zapote again, with Narding heading straight to his classes at the University of Santo Tomas. Lydia arrived back in Santa Mesa, and not long after that, her father called again. He told her that her mother refused to eat and drink because she was not with her. Mrs. Cabading apparently wanted Lydia to drop by again. Lydia may have been hesitant, knowing that Narding was not around, but Jean and Nonilo Kitangon were. They decided to escort Lydia back to her parents' home, and when they arrived there, it became apparent really quickly that Mrs. Cabading was pretending to be asleep and poorly, perhaps at the behest of her own husband, who may have wanted to lure his daughter in one last time. Lydia was not happy about what she may have perceived as a minor deception. I say this because when Jean and Nonilo were in the Cabading's living room with Pablo, whilst Lydia was in her room attempting to pack up her things in preparation for the big move, Pablo told the brothers that he changed his mind. He now wanted Lydia and Narding to move back to Zapote. He was willing to move out with Anunciacion if that made Lydia feel better. Lydia may have already predicted that this would happen, and calling her back from Santa Mesa was just step one in her father's attempt to hold her back yet again. The Quitangon brothers, after listening to Pablo, were perplexed and maybe worried about this, but before they could discuss this any further, the men heard a noise coming from upstairs. Pablo left the brothers to see what was going on. A little while later, the Cabadings came down and Lydia, bizarrely enough, was clutching a crucifix. The Quitangons were expecting her to bring down packed bags full of clothes and other things, but a crucifix? Lydia then told the men to leave and to tell her husband to pick her up later. Jean and Nonilo did not have much of a choice but to follow what Lydia said. So they drove back to Santa Mesa and knew that they had to tell their brother. They called up Narding, who, upon hearing about Lydia being left at Zapote, was not happy at all. He said that he was leaving work right away to drive over to the Cabadings. Narding was warned by his own brothers that by no means should he force his wife to come back with him to Santa Mesa, probably fearing yet another meltdown by Pablo Cabading. Jean then insisted that Narding drove by Santa Mesa first to pick up Nonilo because he did not like the thought of Narding going to Zapote alone. When Narding had finally managed to pick up his brother Nonilo, they hurriedly headed over to the Cabadings. Back in Santa Mesa, Jean had a bad feeling and debated with himself about whether he should go back to Subic to work the next day or whether he should stay and make sure that this matter with Lydia was resolved. I think deep inside he knew that something was coming. By 6:45 that evening, something indeed came in the form of a frantic phone call from Nonilo, who told him that something had happened in the Cabading home. Jean hurriedly left home after telling another younger brother to call the family lawyer and the police and tell them about something potentially happening on Zapote Street. But what exactly happened in the Cabading home, according to Nonilo? As written by Nick Joaquin, it would seem that when Narding and Nonilo arrived at the Cabading home, Pablo received them into the living room, informing Narding that his wife was upstairs in her room. Narding headed upstairs whilst Pablo was getting Nonilo some coffee. Suddenly, they both heard a noise coming from upstairs. Mrs. Cabading was then seen to head upstairs with a glass of milk. Pablo and Nonilo probably sat together in awkward silence, waiting for either Lydia or Narding or both of them to finally come down. But instead, a loud scream came piercing through the big house. Pablo then headed upstairs. From where Nonilo was sitting, he could see Pablo enter Lydia's room because her door was initially left open. But when Pablo arrived inside Lydia's room, he shut the door close. And then it happened. 3 consecutive shots rang out. Nonilo stood up and froze, not sure what to do. Then, a 4th shot rang out. Nonilo finally moved and ran towards the gate and out into the street. He left the gate open. He headed for the next petrol station looking for a phone to call Jean. When Jean finally arrived, Nonilo spotted him, and the 2 brothers were finally reunited. Nonilo at this point noticed that the gate was closed, not at all how he left it. Meanwhile, the Cabading house stood dark, and there was an eerie silence about it. The brothers were thinking that since Nonilo heard gunshots, it was possible that Cabading, a Manila police detective, could still be lurking somewhere on the property. Not long after, the police arrived and the brothers told them that Pablo could still be waiting inside the property, armed and dangerous. The police decided it was time to move into the property. They crawled towards the gate, and somewhere from the property's yard area came one of the maids, running towards them, hysterical and very upset. It was not clear which of the maids this was, but the police could gather from what she said that when she and the other maid heard the gunshots, Foster's son Eduardo was with them, and all three of them decided to hide out in the yard. None of them were hurt, but she did say that it was her who closed the gate after seeing it ajar. This was helpful information for the police because they knew now that there were potentially only 4 people left on the property. The police's plan was to access the back door first. Jean decided to try the locked front door by reaching inside through an open window. He managed to reach the doorknob and unlock it. He entered just as the police were able to gain access through the back door. I'm not entirely sure why Jean was allowed to be an ad hoc part of this initial swoop and visual examination of the property, since he was obviously a civilian with potentially no firearms or protection, but there he was. All of them then slowly headed over to Lydia's room, seeing as the visual examination of the ground floor showed that no one was there and that there was no disturbance at all that should worry the police. The police officer who tried to gain entry into Lydia's room could not open it. Something was blocking the way. At this point, they heard someone moan from inside the room, and then came a voice telling them to push it, just push it, referring to the door. And so they pushed the door until it was wide open. It was dark in the room. The police officer switched on the lights, and as his eyes adjusted to the inside of the room, he and Jean, who was standing close behind him, were confronted by a deeply upsetting and violent crime scene. Here's an excerpt of how Nick Joaquin wrote about how the scene looked like from the police and Jean's perspective.
The entire room was spattered with blood. On the floor, blocking the door, lay Mrs. Cabading. She had been shot in the chest and stomach, but was still alive. The policeman tried to get a statement from her, but all she can say was, my hand, it hurts." She was lying across the legs of her daughter, who lay on top of her husband's body. Lydia was still clutching an armful of clothes. Leonardo was holding a clothes hanger. He had been shot in the breast, she in the heart. They had died instantly together. Sprawled face up on his daughter's bed, his mouth agape and his eyes bulging open, as though still staring in horror, and the bright blood splashed on his face lay Pablo Cabading.
Following the discovery of the crime scene, the police, of course, tried as much as possible to reconstruct what happened inside Lydia's room. This was not an easy task. Even Nick Joaquin, who wrote about this later, did not give a clear explanation or even speculation as to who was shot first. As I understood it, Pablo may have intended to shoot Narding first. Lydia ran to shield him, but Anunciacion also intervened to shield Lydia. All three were shot in the end, with Mrs. Cabading surviving. It is also generally accepted that Pablo shot himself in the right side of his head once, but did not die as a result, prompting him to shoot himself again in the same area. There is also a belief that his body spasmed so violently as a result of the fatal shot that it sent the gun he was holding flying and then landing near Mrs. Cabading's feet. The police were not too sure about this theory, but there was not much of a more plausible explanation left. The police also tried to figure out what the main motive was for the murder-suicide, and sure, they had probably already surmised from the statements made by all the witnesses in this case, especially the Catangon family, that Pablo was not happy with Lydia and her decision to move out, but to them, the specifics will remain a mystery. Some commenters on forums have theorized that the murder-suicide was not planned, that something may have been said in Lydia's room, provoking Pablo Cabading to kill his family and then himself. This would point at a crime of passion instead of something premeditated. Other commenters have said that Pablo had all of this more or less planned out since the day Lydia left for Cavite, and I may have to agree with that theory. I already believe that he was a narcissist and someone who loved being in total control of his family, so losing all that may have triggered something in him that allowed him to come up with a plan that would see Lydia returned to Zapote Street for good. Earlier in this episode, I mentioned how I believe that Pablo Cabading may have been someone with NPD or narcissistic personality disorder. Of course, I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist, and by no means am I making a diagnosis, but I have read up on the matter and researched other similar cases. Pablo Cabading fit the bill of someone who was a narcissist who then also became a family annihilator, someone who commits familicide, and someone who before the crime had to have control, full control that is, of his domain, as in his family. I could glean from Nick Joaquin's article and other sources that Pablo exerted so-called coercive control over his whole family. It is generally accepted that those who exert coercive control can be called abusers. It is a form of emotional and psychological abuse after all. Now, examples of such coercive control behavior are when the abuser isolates the victim from friends, family, and coworkers, or controls what the victim eats and what they wear. The abuser may also start monitoring where the victim is and what they're doing, or monitoring the victim's phone calls, text messages, and other communications. The abuser also tends to repeatedly verbally degrade the victim, for example, by criticizing their looks, income, abilities as a parent, and other things. In a lot of abusive marriages, the abuser also tends to control the victim's finances. Now, not all narcissistic abusers end up becoming family annihilators like Pablo Cabading, but a lot of male family annihilators are narcissists who exert coercive control over their families. Apart from his age, because Pablo was already said to have been in his 50s in 1961, Pablo ticked all the boxes of a family annihilator's profile. Whilst the media back in the Philippines in 1961 wrote about how jealousy may have been the main and ultimate motive for the murder-suicide, I think it was so much more than that. Please note that the following is just my own personal opinion. You see, male family annihilators are commonly triggered by a breakdown in the family or an impending breakdown at least. Issues that could trigger such a breakdown are financial stress, mental health issues, physical health issues, cultural and/or religious issues, just to name a few. This is not to say that it can only be one of these. Indeed, it can be a combination of some or all of these issues. A family annihilator, after all, exists on a continuum. Usually, the scenario is that the abused spouse or partner says they've had enough and also expresses the wish to leave. Sometimes they just leave. The controlling and abusive other half, being the possessive one in this relationship, seeks to regain control of the situation and then as a last resort kills the whole family and in most cases themselves as well. But notice how I say spouse and partner. In the Cabading case, I feel like there may have been a transference of emotions, obsession, and possessiveness. It almost feels like the relationship between Pablo and Lydia was one-sidedly incestuous. Mrs. Cabading was so invisible, voiceless, and docile in this family that she was demoted to just being something a little more than a piece of furniture in her own home. She did not act or speak unless spoken to. She was likely a victim of physical and emotional abuse herself, which may have robbed her of her confidence and self-esteem. In her place, Pablo elevated and became possessive of his own daughter, almost like a proxy wife. He guarded her, made decisions for her, and scared anyone away who could potentially pose as an individual that could take away Lydia's attention from her own father. Interestingly enough, though, I do not think Pablo infantilized Lydia, so his actions were not about keeping her in a childlike state. All he wanted was her full attention, her constant presence, and her blind obedience. For me, it was less about protecting his daughter, the human being, but more about protecting a possession he was obsessed with. When Lydia then coupled up with Narding, married him, and then later expressed the desire to move out with him, this was seen by Pablo as a great slight, an affront to him who wanted to keep his domain that he controlled so well intact. He took Lydia's decision as an attempt to break up his little kingdom on Zapote, much like when a wife of a would-be family annihilator announces that she wants to be separated or divorced or wants to simply move out. This is perceived as an immense betrayal. For a family annihilator, this spouse has now become the reason for the impending breakdown of the family unit. Lydia, in the Cabading case, had become this person for Pablo at that time. She was disturbing the status quo. Since Lydia was, in my opinion, seen by her father as a combination of wife, daughter, and property, her insistence on agency and autonomy was the ultimate last straw. For Pablo, I think, just like the partners of family annihilators who in most cases are killed, Lydia either needed to completely let go of her need to move out or she needed to die. And we now know how this all ended. As for Narding, killing him was in a way an act of revenge for being the catalyst of Lydia wanting to assert herself for the first time in her life. As for the suicide, having realized what he had done, and just like many family annihilators, Pablo knew he ultimately needed to take his own life and that of his wife, perhaps as a way to keep his family together even in death, since he felt he could not do so in life anymore. This explanation is the only way I could make sense of this case, but it also made me think of Filipino family dynamics. There's always been a double standard in the treatment of sons and daughters by their parents. Parents can be less overbearing over their sons. They meddle less in their sons' lives and allow them their agency quite early on. Girls, on the other hand, are taught to fear, especially the male sex. They're taught to fear losing their virginity, the prospect of a teenage pregnancy, losing their honor, being seen as easy to get. In short, girls are in a way indoctrinated very early on that they need protection from the big bad world, and that protection is implicitly and explicitly defined as coming from the male members of her family, especially her father. Instead of giving girls the opportunity to build their confidence, allowing them their agency and autonomy, parents treat them a bit like Rapunzel in the tower. Some parents infantilize them, or some hold God and religion over their heads, whilst others guilt their daughters into being blindly obedient to them. I've seen girls so lacking in confidence that they cannot make their own decisions without looking to their brothers, boyfriends, husbands, fathers, or any close male figures in their lives. I truly believe that this does a disservice to all girls and women who may have to grow up, finally realizing that the male figures in their lives or their opinions may not always be right or may not always be present when needed. The girls who turn into women will need to finally step up and step into their own being, and that can be scary when one has been either handled with kids' gloves their whole lives, or when one has been told for the longest time that without male guidance, one's decision remains invalid. Against this backdrop, we now have the Cabading family who just happened to have a narcissist for a patriarch who also wanted and was successful in controlling a very tight ship. Everyone was afraid of him. Those who stepped out of line got beaten. Those he liked, like Narding during the start of his courtship with Lydia, were charmed to the maximum. But even Narding had to realize very quickly that if he did not abide by the family dynamic as dictated by Pablo, he'd be in trouble too. Alas, it was Lydia who found courage in the end. I think she wanted a better life for her future child. Having grown up on Zapote Street, I think Lydia could not bear to see her own child growing up in a deeply oppressive environment where nothing and no one was allowed to express themselves freely, where physical and emotional abuse was real, and where nothing else mattered but the son at the center of their universe, Pablo Cabading, who just had to take control of his whole family, even if it meant killing them and himself as well. LagimFam, thank you so much for listening to this episode. This was this season's finale, and I really hope you liked it. I announced in the last episode, by the way, that I may take a month-long break, but I think I may have to extend that break for another month because I am in desperate need to just recuperate. I've had a slightly emotionally stormy half year, and I have not really found time to fully unpack all that, so I am taking time off to just see how I can better take care of myself. Whether I may eventually feel like dropping an old Patreon episode or two is a possibility, but I am not making any promises. I may feel like doing so for my birthday, but who knows? For now, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support this season. It has not been an easy one. We've grown so much as a community, and the podcast has definitely reached some impressive milestones. All thanks to you. Please never grow tired of supporting Lagim because I will never grow tired of creating content for the Lagim fam. Thank you again for listening. Check the show notes for ways to support me or where to follow me on social media. Until next season, Lagim fam, maraming salamat at mabuhay.